Cool. Yeah. So today I'm going to be talking about some work I've been doing over the last year of my PhD. And I'd like to thank my colleague Elaine, who's done a lot of work of the work with me, and our supervisors Richard Apps and Rui Pontecosta. So if you open up someone's head, you'll see this large and very recognizable structure, which we call the neocortex, the most famous part really of the central nervous system. But connected to it at the bottom, you'll also find this thing called the cerebellum, which is more modest, but we also think that there's a big role it has to play within the central nervous system. And in particular, we think that its loop that it forms with the neocortex is very important for learning adaptation, both of motor control, but also more recently, other cognitive tasks, language, even maths, and really any cognitive process is now being shown to be linked maybe to cerebellar processes. So in the motor control case, we have this nice model where we think that the cerebellum, for example, if you want to move your hand, the cerebellum would predict, would make some internal model about what it means to move your hand. And if you send some motor command, for example, to move your hand, the cerebellum would know in advance what to expect and help the motor cortex, in this case, to prepare its activity and to react faster than could be processed by the normal sensory processing pathways. So yes, so the cerebellum wants to replace this feedback, somehow makes an internal model of this feedback, which is inherently slow. When you see something and it gets to your neocortex, this process takes in the hundreds of milliseconds. So we want to ask, what exactly does the cerebellum do to help the neocortex in motor learning and perhaps other forms of learning? Right. So we make the model of the brain or the nervous system as a forward network of control, starting from sensory input we receive from, for example, something that you see. As an example, maybe you see a basketball hoop that you want to throw a ball in. That will send a motor command, which is sent to your arm so that you can move your arm such that the ball can go into the basketball hoop. And so we have this forward processing, which are these H's from visual stimuli onto the motor areas, onto your hand. But we also get this feedback signals, which go back a similar route back down the network. And we think we think that this feedback activity is very important for learning and synaptic plasticity. And in our case, we're going to interpret this feedback activity as some kind of encoding of gradients. So we're going to introduce another separate network, which we call the cerebellum. So if we view this on our left as the neocortex, we have also the cerebellum. And we're going to make the claim that the cerebellum is actually predicting these gradients given the activity of a certain brain area. So in this case, for example, the cerebellum receives an efferent copy of some motor command and will make some prediction based on that motor command in the form of gradients. And how do these predictions make sense? Well, the cerebellum itself will learn to mimic these true gradients, this true feedback activity via the inferior olive, where it will compare its prediction with eventual what we call backpropagated signal or feedback signal given from your hand or your leg or whatever. And this setup is exactly what was proposed a few years ago in the deep learning community by Jederberg et al. And it's called decoupled neural interfaces. And the idea is that we have now multiple brain regions or parts of the central nervous system which can work asynchronously without having to wait each other. It just has this kind of special relationship and loop with the cerebellum module. So this is the motor case, but this can actually easily be extended to any kind of forward process within the brain. So we can actually think about this more in the cognitive domain, where perhaps we see some visual stimuli, or maybe we hear a certain bit of language, make some associations with that language, and perhaps make a response based on that. And we think that the cerebellum even in this case, making constant predictions about what to expect in the future. So it's important to note that this predictions works in the spatial case, where it's predicting activity coming back from other brain regions, but also in the temporal case. So we tested this model on a simple target reaching task where there's a temporal constraint where it receives input at time step 0, and then 10 time steps later we'll have to associate that input with some target that it wants to get to. And we compare 3 modules, one, a normal recurrent neural network, in this case an LSTM, without a cerebellum component, and then we compare both the cerebellum components joined to that, as well as a sparsely connected cerebellum component. So the cerebellum is kind of unique. 2 unique qualities of the cerebellum is this massive divergence onto the granule cell layer. I'll go back a slide. There's this massive divergence onto the granule cell layer, but there's also notably the sparse connectivity from the input, which is the mossy fibers, onto these granule cells. So we compare 3 modules, one without the cerebellum, one densely connected cerebellum module, but one sparsely connected cerebellum module. And so for this task, we see that the cerebellum, without the cerebellum, it's actually incredibly difficult for the current neural network to associate some original input with a target and hardly learns at all. Whereas with the cerebellum components, it manages to do pretty well. And if you actually extend that with sparse connections, it performs even better. And the learning curves look something like this, where, as we see, it's a non-cerebellum brain hardly learns at all. Whereas with this cerebellum, cerebellum component being able to transport signals from the future onto the present input, we see good learning takes place. And this can be extended to harder sensorimotor tasks. So we actually tested this also on the sequential MNIST task, where each time step the model would receive a row of a number from the MNIST data sets, and then either has to classify that number, so a classification task, or has to associate that number with some 2D coordinate around a circle. And in both cases, we see, again, the advantages of the cerebellum components. The LSTM doesn't do so great by itself, but when you add these cerebellum components, which make these predicted gradients, we see, again, reduced error and better learning. So, okay, so something we kind of were surprised about were why the sparse connection seems to help learning for both these tasks that we've seen so far. So we looked at whether there are any decorrelating effects that happen in the sparsely connected cerebellum. So this was noted by Keiko Gage now a few years ago, that with sparse connections inherently comes decorrelation within the cerebellum hidden layer, so our granule cells. So here we tested a variety of input correlations. So this is our correlations of the LSTM. And with higher correlations with a densely connected cerebellum, which is an orange, we see that we actually get worse performance. And this is because it's a harder job, right? We've got more correlated input, it's harder to differentiate them. But if we were to, if we introduce sparsity on our network, then it actually seems to counteract these effects of initial correlations, and the error remains relatively stable. And here we show explicitly how the synthetic gradients that are produced within the network, i.e. the activity of the cerebellum module, the correlation is higher for a densely connected cerebellum compared to a sparse. And this is true both for the target region task, and we also saw it in the sequential MNIST tasks. Okay, so the nice thing about our network is that it can be applied not just to sensorimotor tasks, but any kind of task. So we also tested this on a language modeling task, where we asked the network to predict the next word of a sentence, and we can, we asked the network to make a caption of given an image, and we can generate our own sentences given an image with our models. And we see here in gray our non-cerebellum model, and again our densely connected model in orange and sparsely connected in green. And we saw some qualitative difference in the types of sentences being produced. So this would be akin to cerebellar patients showing some kind of language deficits, which actually has been shown experimentally. And again, if you look at the learning curves, then we see advantages with the cerebellum components. They are, I think, somewhat slighter, but they are still significant compared to the sensorimotor tasks. Right, so conclusions. Well, we've introduced a new model of the cerebellum, in particular its link with its interaction with the neocortex, and how we could perhaps view the cerebellum as enabling this kind of decoupled neural interface, as proposed a few years ago in the deep learning community, and allow that different cortical areas to compute forward and feedback activity asynchronously. We've shown the advantages of the sparse connections within the cerebellum. So this notable quality that only each granular cell in the cerebellum receives 4 different inputs has been demonstrated to show computational advantages in this case, in our learning tasks. And these tasks, both in the motor case and the cognitive case, the results of our model and the way it learns is consistent with experimental observations. Cerebellar patients have been shown to not only perform tasks worse, but also learn more slowly. And we think that our model is consistent with this. And finally, our model predicts, or would have shown, that it is especially valuable for tasks in which there's, for temporally challenging tasks, in which there's only a loss signal or a reward signal coming later in time, which needs to be transported into some original action or activity. Okay, that's it. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. That was a really clear and really interesting talk. So while we wait for questions from the audience, maybe could you elaborate a bit on why you chose the particular tasks that you chose, and maybe how it links to the deficits in cerebellar patients a little bit more?
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, we wanted to make a task that resembled something of a motor task, so with some kind of initial stimulus and some kind of action that we would relate to that stimulus. We know that the cerebellum's important for time. And we wanted to capture that with this temporal task. And that's why we chose the sensorimotor task. But we also wanted to look at how this model generalizes into perhaps harder cognitive tasks to see how maybe, the thing with the cerebellum, it's kind of interesting. You think that it's actually, I think originally it was created for the motor purpose. But I think the brain has a good way of generalizing things, and it's been shown now to actually be involved in much more. The cerebellum actually grew at a similar rate as the neocortex, even though the neocortex was doing far more than motor stuff. So I think it's just interesting to see how our model can capture how the cerebellum might generalize into different tasks from sensorimotor and into the cognitive domain.
Yeah, thank you. It's a beautiful demonstration of such a wide range of tasks. Okay. I guess if there's no questions, from the audience, or I don't know if any of our panelists want to ask a question, you can unmute. We might move on to the next speaker. Thank you so much, Joseph. That was an excellent talk.
Thank you.
Okay.